Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, President Biden expects U.S. troops to be killed in Iraq or Syria. So this is really something here. The New York Times reported on Sunday that President Biden and his top advisors worry that it's just a matter of time before an American soldier is killed in Iraq or Syria amid a flurry of rocket attacks against U.S. bases that are being launched by Shia militias, and these attacks started in response to Biden's full-throated support for the Israeli slaughter in Gaza. So U.S. officials suggested that if an American is killed, President Biden would attack Iran directly, which could provoke a major war, which would very, very likely provoke a huge war. Iran is allied with these Shia militias that have been taking credit for the attacks on U.S. troops, but Tehran has denied that it's involved in these operations, and these Shia militias are known to act independently. And back in October, we haven't seen them really comment on this recently, but when these attacks first started, the Pentagon said that it had no evidence Iran was directing these attacks. And a U.S. official told CNN that it was a persistent intelligence gap, I didn't really phrase that properly. The official said that whether or not the Shia militias act independently is a persistent intelligence gap, meaning they don't know if they're acting on Iran's behest here. And again, they have their own interests. They really want the U.S. out of Iraq. That's all part of this as well. And by this logic that, these groups attacking the U.S. means the U.S. can bomb Iran, by that logic, Russia has every right to bomb NATO, to bomb the U.S. The media really plays right along with this whole way of looking at this. Whenever you see them talking about these attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria, or these militias, they say Iran-backed militias, Iranian-backed groups. And we see the same thing with the Houthis, the Iranian-backed Houthis. It's always in there in the Western media reports on the Houthis and these Shia militias inside the story, and a lot of times even in the headlines. That's like if every story we wrote was the U.S.-backed Ukrainians, the U.S.-backed Israelis. This report said that U.S. officials have been debating how to respond to the attacks and don't want to go so far that the conflict would escalate into a full-fledged war, particularly by striking Iran directly. However, if an American is killed, the U.S. officials say that they may have no choice but to attack Iran. The report reads, "That is a red line that has not been crossed, but if the Iranian-backed militias ever have a day of better aim or better luck, it easily could be," end quote. And this New York Times report kind of framed it as, they would have no choice, even though the choice right now, the obvious choice would be to get out of Iraq and get out of Syria. You have the Iraqi government saying that they want the U.S. to leave. Biden thinks American troops are going to die. They're supposedly there to fight ISIS. Iraq says they can handle ISIS, no problem. It's very clear, what this is about, the whole point of this presence. And it's a tripwire for war with Iran. And so one thing, so this report is kind of vague. It doesn't really get into specific plans of what the U.S. might bomb in Iran. And it doesn't really, it's not really clear if they mean the U.S. would bomb Iranian territory or if they would kill Iranian military officers or troops that are in Syria and Iraq. We've seen, and they really just have military advisors there. And we've seen Israel recently, the airstrikes that they launched in Damascus over the weekend killed 5 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And Israel seems like it's trying to provoke a war with Iran because they know the U.S. would definitely intervene directly in that. So this is a real chance here that this thing could escalate into a war between the U.S. and Iran. And there's no sign of anybody backing down. I saw today, I haven't been covering every attack on these U.S. bases because they happen, it seems like, almost every day. I saw today there was another one in Syria. And so far, no U.S. troops have been killed. About 70 have been injured. But they're just keeping them out there like sitting ducks, keeping them in harm's way. And it makes you think, are they trying to provoke a war with Iran? Is this actually what the U.S. wants as well? All right, so the next one here, the U.S. and the U.K. launch more strikes in Yemen, and the U.S. names its new war. So the U.S. and the U.K. launched more strikes against the Houthis in Yemen on Monday, as the U.S. military named its new war against the Yemeni group Operation Poseidon Archer. So that's their fancy name for this operation. And these strikes marked the 8th time that the U.S. has bombed Yemen since January 12th, the 8th time in about 10 days, and the 2nd time that the British joined in. So if you remember, the British joined in on the first round of airstrikes, which were pretty extensive, and now they're joining in again. And President Biden continues to order strikes after acknowledging that they were not working to stop the Houthis, and the U.S. is planning for an open-ended conflict here. A correspondent for Al Mayadeen reported attacks in several areas in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a and its surroundings. The U.S. and the U.K. released a joint statement saying that the strikes were launched against 8 Houthi targets. So this U.S. and British statement says, quote, "Today, the militaries of the United States and the United Kingdom, at the direction of their respective governments with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands, conducted an additional round of proportionate and necessary strikes against 8 Houthi targets in Yemen in response to the Houthis' continued attacks against international and commercial shipping, as well as naval vessels transiting the Red Sea," end quote. So this new bombing campaign has dramatically escalated the situation in the region. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, are now targeting American commercial vessels, and many more shipping companies have suspended transit through the Red Sea. The Houthis have vowed that they will not back down and say the only way they'll stop is if the Israeli slaughter in Gaza ends, and they reaffirm this after these latest U.S. and British strikes. Mohammed al-Bukaidi, he's a member of Ansar Allah's political bureau. He wrote on X after these strikes, quote, "No matter how much they bomb, our military operation against Israel will continue until the genocide crimes in Gaza are stopped and food, medicine, and fuel are allowed to enter its besieged population," end quote. And in another post, al-Bukaiti said that the U.S. and British attacks will, quote, "only increase the Yemeni people's determination to carry out their moral and humanitarian responsibilities towards the oppressed in Gaza," end quote. And so the Houthis have endured a very brutal bombing campaign before from 2015 to 2022. The U.S.-backed Saudi-UAE coalition. And that war killed 377,000 people, according to the UN estimate. Brutal conflict, included a blockade, and that just made the Houthis stronger, it seemed like. So it really is an open-ended conflict. There's no indication that anything the U.S. is doing is going to stop the Houthis. All right, so the next one here. Normal Yemenis will suffer most in the U.S. Houthi fight. This is an article from Connor Eccles, and it's actually an interview with a aid official, Ashley Subrahmanian Montgomery. She's the associate director of the Charity and Security Network, discussing the idea of this new terrorist designation. So Biden recently redesignated the Houthis as specially designated global terrorists, which includes new sanctions, and this could complicate aid deliveries into Yemen. And the bombing has already disrupted some aid and relief efforts. And one thing that I thought, she kind of explained the distinction between, so you have the specially designated terrorist designation that the U.S. reimposed, but they didn't go as far to put on the foreign terrorist organization designation. And there is kind of a distinction. Still, these sanctions are going to disrupt things, but probably not as bad as the FTO, because I didn't realize just how harsh the sanctions are that the FTO designation comes with. She said that when an FTO designation goes into effect, most types of engagement with an FTO are then prohibited, and anybody running afoul of this, any individual organization, can face really hefty fines and can face really dire criminal penalties, including up to 10 years of jail time. So it's pretty severe, and they cause a big chilling impact and effect on humanitarian aid. But again, these aid groups are already seeing a disruption with the escalation of hostilities, and now these new sanctions are going to make the situation more difficult. Even though they say they have exemptions time and time again, history shows us that sanctions always cause shortages of things like food, medicine, even if there's exemptions. And in Yemen, the population is in such a dire situation because of that brutal war that any kind of disruptions could lead to really horrific consequences. So this is all part of Biden's new war against the Houthis, against Yemen. All right, so the next one here. Israel offers a 2-month truce for hostages, according to a report from Axios. So this was on Monday that this was reported. And I was surprised to see this because 2 months is kind of a long time. It says that Israel has proposed to Hamas through Egyptian and Qatari mediators a 2-month ceasefire as part of a multi-phase deal that would include the release of all remaining hostages. The report comes a day after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu publicly rejected an offer from Hamas to free the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of Israeli troops, and the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners. So according to this report, which cited Israeli officials, the Israeli offer would not end the war, but the 2-month period is the longest ceasefire that Israel has offered so far. The previous hostage deal, if you remember, freed over 100 Israelis and over 200 Palestinians. It involved a 3-day truce that was extended up to 7 days. Israeli officials said the new Israeli proposal made clear that they're not offering to end the slaughter in Gaza, which has killed over 25,000 Palestinians. They are also not willing to release all 6,000 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons, but would enter negotiations to determine how many Palestinians would be released for each type of Israeli hostage. So Hamas is looking to get a lot more for the soldiers that they have. And this deal would be in phases. The first phase would include the release of Israelis over the age of 60 and hostages who are in critical medical condition. The next phase would include the release of men under the age of 60, Israeli soldiers, and bodies of hostages who have died. So, when it comes to Hamas, if they would go for something like this, I don't think so, just because then their leverage is gone. So if they do this 2-month thing and then Israel, ramps everything up again, then, they don't really have any footing for negotiations. And it's also hard for me to believe that Israel's really willing to do this, especially with everything Netanyahu's been doing and saying. But we'll see what happens in the coming days. And you have Hamas is saying, we'll release all the hostages if they end, if they end this thing. And so there's also, one reason why Israel might actually be offering something like this is that there are a lot of signs here that their ground invasion is not going very well. We know Israel's nowhere near close to its goal of eradicating Hamas, and it is far behind on its military goals, which included taking over the cities of Khan Younis and Rafah by the end of December. But Khan Younis, there's a lot of horrific stuff going on there, but they don't control that whole city, and Rafah they haven't even tried to take over yet. And Hamas is also reasserting its presence in areas of Gaza City. But it shows at least, negotiations are happening. All right, so the next one here, relatives of hostages disrupt Israeli Knesset meeting. So relatives of Israeli hostages being held in Gaza disrupted a meeting of the Israeli Knesset's Finance Committee and demanded the government do more to secure the release of their families. The protesters yelled, "You will not sit here while our children die." They held up signs, pictures of their family members, and chanted, "Release them now," things like that. The protesters had to be forcibly removed from the Knesset meeting, and the protest came a day after Netanyahu rejected that offer from Hamas. And he did it in a very public way. He said, outright, we reject this. They want us to surrender, to capitulate. We're not doing that. We're going to keep going. And they, it was a real scene that they caused. You could see them break in here on the video, really flood into the room, and they're yelling at all these Israeli lawmakers. So it shows the frustration and kind of the pressure that the Israeli government is under, because these people are saying, diplomacy, make a deal. That's what they want, because they've realized that, like that story I covered yesterday, the senior Israeli military leaders saying that the only way to free the hostages, to get them home alive, is through diplomacy, not through military means. And Netanyahu has been under increasing pressure, not only from these hostage families, but also now some dissent within his war cabinet. This could all factor into Israel making that proposal to Hamas. All right, so the next one here. Most Israelis believe that Netanyahu is acting for his personal interest. The majority of Israelis believe Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's wartime decision-making is primarily motivated by his own personal interest. This is according to a survey conducted by Israel's Channel 13. The survey found that 53% of respondents believed Netanyahu was acting for himself, and only 33% said he was acting for the good of the country. The Channel 13 survey found that if elections were held in Israel today, former Defense Minister Benny Gantz's National Unity Party would win more seats in the Knesset than any other party, with Netanyahu's Likud party coming in second. Gantz, a member of Israel's war cabinet, would then be tasked to form a government, and Netanyahu would be ousted as prime minister. Other polling has shown the majority of Israelis want Netanyahu to resign once the brutal Israeli campaign in Gaza is over, giving him the incentive to continue the assault and provoke a wider war. And it's clear that that's what Israel's trying to do with all these strikes in Lebanon and Syria. And U.S. officials did recently tell the Washington Post that they fear Netanyahu might view a full-blown war in Lebanon as key to his political survival. Despite that, the U.S. is still providing this unconditional military aid. And there was another report in HuffPost that said there were U.S. officials were worried that that policy of giving Israel whatever it wants, no matter what, is going to lead to a major, major war. All right. So the next one here, Israel cannot destroy one half of Hamas's tunnel network. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And this is more signs that Israel's campaign is not going well. Several sources within the Israeli Defense Forces say it will be unable to destroy most of Hamas's tunnel network under Gaza. Netanyahu has pledged that the Israeli military will eliminate Hamas, but it is becoming increasingly clear that Tel Aviv will not be able to achieve that goal. IDF officials at all levels, including generals, say that destroying the tunnels is impossible. The report, this is from Haaretz. It says, quote, the IDF is scaling down its forces in Gaza City with full knowledge that many tunnels have been overlooked. This shouldn't come as a surprise. The tunnels under the Gaza Strip were there even before Hamas's founding in 1987, and it seems they'll be here after this war too, end quote. The Israeli outlet explains that the Israeli military command was surprised by the extent of the tunnel network under Gaza, and that was in the thing I covered yesterday, that the Israelis initially believed it was something like 100 miles of tunnels, and now they believe there's 450 miles of tunnels under Gaza, which is just a huge network, giving Hamas, the leadership, just plenty of places to hide. So, and penetrating that, sending Israeli troops down there would be a suicide mission. So, and that's part of the reason why they're seeing Hamas pop back up in Gaza cities, because they have all these tunnels and these entrances to them. All right, so the next one here, Israeli forces storm hospital at Khan Younis as Khan Younis is hit by bloodiest fighting. And I guess I technically don't pronounce Khan Younis correctly. It's a Khan Younis would be the correct, but it's tough for me to say that. Anyway, this article is from Reuters, and it's really bad what's happening in the south. This idea that the war that Israel has reduced its operations is just not true. It's very intense right now down there. So Israeli forces advancing deep into western Khan Younis in Gaza's bloodiest fighting so far in January, stormed one hospital and put another under siege on Monday, cutting off the wounded from trauma care. Troops advanced for the first time into the Al-Mawasi district near the Mediterranean coast, west of Khan Younis, the main city in southern Gaza. There they stormed the Al-Khar hospital and were arresting medical staff, Gaza Health Ministry spokesman Ashraf Al-Qidra told Reuters. There was no word from Israel on the situation at the hospital, and the military spokesperson's office had no comment. The military said later that 3 Israeli soldiers were killed on Monday in southern Gaza. At least 50 people were killed overnight in the city of Khan Younis, while the sieges of medical facilities meant dozens of dead and wounded were beyond the reach of rescuers. So they're saying that they're preventing ambulance vehicles from moving to recover bodies that were wounded in western Khan Younis. The Palestinian Red Crescent said tanks had surrounded another hospital, Al Amal, headquarters of the rescue agency, which had lost contact with the staff there. And they are digging graves at the hospital because they can't get out. It's just a really horrific situation. Video filmed from afar showed scattered civilians, and this is in the area of Khan Younis. Video filmed from afar showed scattered civilians wandering around a ghost city crowded with tents, abandoned laundry flapping on lines as gunfire rattled and smoke rose into the sky. This is in here somewhere, but that the Palestinians at the hospital are digging graves and burying people and burying children that are dead on the hospital grounds because they can't make it out to the cemetery. And they have a quote in here from John Kirby, the White House National Security Council spokesman, who said that, we don't want them to... Well, I'll just read his quote. He said, quote, "We expect them to do so in accordance with international law and to protect innocent people in hospitals, medical staff, and patients as well as much as possible," end quote. So he's saying that they can defend themselves, but they should protect people at hospitals. But how many hospitals have they attacked? Have they put under siege? How many hospitals are inoperable now? They've been attacking hospitals. It's been a feature of what they're doing in Gaza. And to pretend like the U.S. actually cares about that while they're still providing this unconditional military aid is just complete nonsense. Just shows what a propagandist John Kirby is. All right, so the next one here. The U.S. demands a probe into the death of a Palestinian-American in the West Bank. So this article is from Al Jazeera, and a Palestinian-American teenage boy, a 17-year-old Taufik Ajak, was killed by Israeli forces, or I've seen some accounts say he was killed by an Israeli settler. Others say an Israeli soldier. It's not really clear the circumstances of his death. So the U.S. is calling for an investigation. He's one of about 360 Palestinians who have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. The settlers are being, much more aggressive. They feel kind of emboldened by all the tensions. And again, it's not clear exactly what happened in this situation, but he was born and raised in the U.S. This says his parents only brought him to the West Bank last year. And I saw his father spoke at the funeral saying, our taxes in the U.S. are funding this military that kills our family. So the State Department's calling for an investigation. We've seen it before when Israelis kill Americans. I'm thinking of Shireen Abu Ekla, the Al Jazeera journalist. She was a Palestinian-American who was killed by Israeli troops back in 2021. That didn't change things. That didn't change the U.S. relationship, the U.S. support. So they're going to act like they're concerned, but nothing, I doubt it's going to change anything. And I guess it would depend on what they find in, this investigation anyway. When it comes to Abu Ekla, the Israelis initially denied that they killed her, and then they eventually admitted that they did. All right, so the last story here, shifting over to Ukraine. Slovakia's prime minister says that Ukraine must give up territory. Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico said over the weekend that the only way to end the war in Ukraine is for Kiev to give up some of its territory to Russia. So he said, quote, "There has to be some kind of compromise. What do they expect, that the Russians will leave Crimea, Donbass, and Luhansk? That's unrealistic," end quote. Fico was elected toward the end of 2023 after campaigning to end Slovakia's support for the war in Ukraine. His government followed through on that pledge and stopped supplying Ukraine with military aid, which is significant because Slovakia is a NATO country. And Fico will meet with Ukraine's prime minister on Wednesday, and he said he's going to tell him that Slovakia will block any attempts to bring Ukraine into NATO. He said, quote, "I will tell him that I am against the membership of Ukraine in NATO and that I will veto it. It would merely be a basis for World War III, if nothing else," end quote. So he also said Ukraine was not a sovereign nation because it's under the total influence and control of the United States. So responding to these comments, Ukraine's foreign ministry said that Kiev would not give up any territory that they're going to fight on. And we've seen that from Zelensky and other top Ukrainian officials. They're still saying that they're going to drive Russia out of all this territory. And Zelensky's still pushing his so-called peace plan that would require Russia to give up Crimea and Russia to go through war crimes tribunals, just all these completely unrealistic demands that the Ukrainians are making. But things are, I do need to cover this more. Someone mentioned in the comments yesterday, we ran this story in the lower part of the page. I didn't think too much of it, but there was an attack on a Russian gas facility on the Baltic Sea near St. Petersburg in the Leningrad Oblast, which is really far from Ukraine. It's like something like 500 miles from the Ukrainian border. So the question is, where did they launch that attack from? An attack on the Baltic Sea. Ukraine has launched some attacks pretty deep into Russian territory, but I believe that as far as I've seen, that's the deepest drone attack. They've done some pretty far in, but that is definitely something to keep an eye on. Russia has not officially blamed Ukraine for the attack yet, but it's definitely something that could really escalate things. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Norman Solomon, How the Gaza War Can Be Big News and Invisible at the Same Time. One from Scott Horton, U.S. troops in Iraq are a tripwire for war with Iran. And that's his take on that report, that Biden's expecting U.S. troops to be killed and could bomb Iran in response. One thing Scott mentions is that ISIS has an incentive to kind of provoke a war between the U.S. and the Shia militias and Iran. They could take advantage of the chaos. So go check that out. One from Shane Marshall, How VC is busting the military-industrial complex for its own benefit. One from Adam Johnson, Blinken admits entire Gaza strategy is premised on pointless mass death. And one from Caitlin Johnstone, Biden has started another U.S. war. She's talking about the war against the Houthis in Yemen. Go check that out. She quotes from one of my articles in there, which is always very, very cool. But that's everything for me for today. You can always support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends. Tell them to check out antiwar.com. If you listen on YouTube or if you watch on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, you could subscribe and leave comments and all that stuff. I appreciate all that. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.